December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii. A day that will live on in infamy, in which 2,400 men lost their lives. For some, it was a normal day, and for others, it was their last. Here are the stories of Pearl Harbor.
Please state your name.
My name is Louise Chu Sims. I had turned 14 by December 7th. And at 7:40 in the morning, the phone rang, and it's a Sunday morning. So I jumped up and answered it, and it was my friend Janet. She said, quick, turn on your radio. And I said, Janet, everybody's asleep. She said, turn on your radio. We're being attacked. We're being bombed.
Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941. Japan used the element of surprise to attack Pearl Harbor. Only a few hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan formally declared war against the U.S. The event of Pearl Harbor shocked and scared Americans all across the nation. But there was also a rise of patriotism after Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor led to the U.S. joining the World War II, which before this was a European war. Many American men signed up for the war to fight against the Axis powers. In the U.S., there was a rise of anti-Japanese feelings.
In the little corridor, and just as I got close, the door opened and a woman came in holding her daughter's hand. She looked at me, she grabbed her daughter and she said, "Get away from that Jap!" And I remember standing there looking at her, looking at the kid, and I wanted to say, "But I'm not." And she pushed past me and ran that way. I never got to tell her that I wasn't Japanese, but I don't think it mattered to her.
This would help lead to the creation of Japanese internment camps in the U.S. as a way to try and find Japanese spies. No spies were ever found.
As for Japan themselves, propaganda posters amongst the public promoted a positive outlook of the country, being rather gentle and happy in their persuasion. Posters often depicted children and younger citizens in order to try and promote cooperation of all. In addition, the usage of this also helped men to find something to fight for, their own wives and children. Amongst the people, these posters were very gentle and calming and made the war seem less intimidating. It kept the people calm and motivated in times of destruction and hatred. These posters attempted to unite the people. On the contrary, the posters aimed towards men and those eligible to join the war effort became very dark, scary, and harsh. Posters depicting fighter jet bombings on Allied lands, as well as lots of Western slander, helped to increase the hatred for the Allied powers. The Japanese would encourage rationing of anything and everything, stating that consumerism of the West was their enemy. They also held a large superiority complex in comparison to the Western world, mentioning that their military was superior in quality and quantity. This all helped to fuel a sense of rage and anti-Western hate. This patriotism helped to aid them in participating in traditional Japanese practices, such as Bushido, the code of honor followed by Japanese samurai. Samurai were often used on posters to convey this tradition. One of the more forgotten battles of World War II happens to be the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific Island region. This battle, in accordance with the Battle of Midway, marked a turning point in the war for the Allied forces. The small Pacific island was used as a rest point between the United States and Australia, so taking the island over was crucial for America. Similar to Japan and Pearl Harbor, the American troops, commanded by Major General Alexander Vandegrift, launched a surprise attack on Guadalcanal on the night of August 7, 1942, surprising the 2,000 Japanese soldiers. American troops were able to gain the airfield and the harbor on the neighboring Florida island. Strong naval enforcement was ordered as well as on land. However, the Japanese easily retaliated against the Navy, sinking and severely damaging a good majority of American ships. In fact, so many ships were sunk over the course of a couple months that the area along the coast of the islands became known as the Iron Bottom Sound. Only about 4 months later, Guadalcanal would be faced with yet another attack. The United States had recently just sent a supply restock on November 11th and 12th of 1942. At the same time, the Japanese had attempted to conduct another surprise attack on the American fleets, hiding behind their cargo ships. Much to their demise, the American generals stationed on the island detected the ships and quickly sent destroyers and cruisers to combat. This led to an extremely gruesome and tragic battle with many perishing on both sides. Although a gruesome battle, the US was left in a position of strength, and it helped to boost the confidence of the American people. Along with naval advancements, the United States was also able to control the Japanese fleets by bombing them from the air. Additionally, on land, Vandegrift placed 11,000 troops around the perimeter of Henderson Field after being warned of an attack after cryptanalysis decoded the Japanese naval code. The Japanese underestimated the sheer size of American troops and began to get pushed back slowly to the northeast tip of the island. Finally, in February of 1943, the Allied troops had finally seized the last Japanese area of Guadalcanal, and the island was now theirs. The aftermath of the recapture of the island gave Americans great pride, as well as helped their position in the war, as they could now restock and communicate better with other allies. Additionally, after this victory, the Axis powers never threatened the US's position in the Solomon Islands again. The Japanese lost over 24,000 men, while the US lost only about 1,400, with about 4,500 wounded and suffering from tropical illnesses such as malaria. Although not a well-known battle, the Battle of Guadalcanal, which lasted 6 months, was certainly a huge accomplishment during World War II.
However, with war, we don't seem to realize the sheer gravity of a fatality until it happens to one of our own.
How many brothers did you have?
3.
What were their names and ages?
Frank, Richard, and Nicolo. I remember we were in the movies, and I heard a lot of noise over the radio. They had, the Garlic House, Strand's Theater, and he had a radio in there. I heard a lot of noise. When I got home, Mama said, "We're at war." So I was saying, "Oh, is that bad?" I said, I was a kid. What the heck did I know?
What was the hardest part of, living through the war?
Oh, we got news.
The youngest brother, Nicky, or my uncle Nick, was killed.
Got news of my brother. It was terrible. I'm sorry.
How old was your brother when he passed?
19. Yeah, I was about 14, I think.
Oh, tell
We
me.
got a telegram from the taxi guy. He brought it, and I answered the door. And then I read it, because every week you could see somebody was
Right.
killed in the war. And I said, oh, gee, when I saw him,
Yeah.
that did it.
During World War II, women worked in factories, producing munitions, building ships and airplanes. They worked in the auxiliary service as air raid wardens, fire officers, and evacuation officers. They worked as drivers of fire engines, trains, and trams. They worked as conductors, and they also worked as nurses. During this period, some trade unions serving traditionally male occupations like engineering began to admit female members. At first, many male factory owners did not want to hire women because they believed that women aren't fit for the dirty and dangerous factory jobs. But the country knew that without women, the Allies would lose the war. So the government launched a campaign to change people's minds about women workers, and it worked. More than 6 million women took wartime jobs in factories, 3 million volunteered with the Red Cross, and over 200,000 served in the military. Women's auxiliary branches were created for every branch of the military, including the Women's Army Corps, WWII, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, WAVES, and Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP. Women were restricted from combat zones, however, many became nurses to help the men injured in combat.
As for the economic efforts during World War II, the war brought back victory gardens as a way to grow more food for the troops who were away at war and to help with food shortages. These gardens were planted anywhere there was space. Such places included San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, the Portland Zoo in Oregon, and Boston's Copley Square and Fenway. Women also stepped up and filled the role of men in factories when men were away fighting in the war. Because of women working in factories, the economy was able to stay stable. During the war, over 17 million new jobs were created because of the need for more workers to help make good for the war. Industrialization also drastically increased. Before joining World War II, the U.S. was still in the Great Depression. Joining the war seemed to get the U.S. out of its depression because of the increased spending on war efforts. Despite the war efforts, nothing would prepare Americans for D-Day.
The planning of D-Day took a very long time, and many argue that this was what caused its success. The plan was to take place in 3 phases. First, the paratroopers would be dropped behind the beaches at night to confuse the enemy and seize the roads and bridges that led inland. Then a wave of airplanes were to batter German defenses, destroy enemy emplacements, and create craters on the beaches in which assault troops would take shelter. Finally, a massive flotilla was to carry thousands of British, Canadian, and American troops towards the French coast. The Allied commanders planned 5 coordinated landings along a 45-mile stretch of the Normandy coastline between the Cotentin Peninsula and the Oron River. Canadian and British troopers under General Bernard Montgomery would fight their way ashore at beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword. Americans under General Omar Bradley would assault Utah and Omaha beaches. The battle began on June 6, 1944, and lasted for 2 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. In November 1943, Adolf Hitler, who was aware of the threat of an invasion along France's northern coast, put Erwin Rommel in charge of spearheading defensive operations in the region, even though the Germans did not know exactly where the Allies would strike. Hitler charged Rommel with finishing the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile fortification of bunkers, landmines, and beaches and water obstacles. In January 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower was appointed commander of Operation Overlord. In the months and weeks before D-Day, the Allies carried out a massive deception operation intended to make the Germans think the main invasion target was past the Calais, rather than Normandy. In addition, they led the Germans to believe that Norway and other locations were also potential invasion targets. Many tactics were used to carry out the deception, included fake equipment, a phantom army commanded by George Patton and supposedly based in England from past the Calais, double agents, and fraudulent radio transmissions. By dawn on January 6, thousands of paratroopers and glider troops were already on the ground behind enemy lines, securing bridges and exit routes. The invasions began at 6:30 a.m. The British and Canadians overcame light opposition to capture beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword, as did the Americans at Utah Beach. U.S. forces faced heavy resistance at Omaha Beach, where there were over 2,000 American casualties. However, by day's end, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had successfully stormed Normandy's beach. According to some estimates, more than 4,000 Allied troops lost their lives in the D-Day invasion, with thousands more wounded or missing. Less than a week later, on June 11th, the beaches were fully secured and over 326,000 troops, more than 50,000 vehicles, and some 100,000 tons of equipment had landed at Normandy.
Although World War II was a very gruesome and tragic war, if it weren't for the compliance of the American people, as well as the great leadership from generals, America would not be the country it is today. I would like to give a big thank you to Louise Chu Sims for allowing us to interview her and to get further knowledge on Pearl Harbor. Here is a piece of shrapnel Louise's cousin caught whilst fishing from the bomb at Pearl Harbor. Here is also a blood bank card Louise had to carry around after Pearl Harbor. I would like to say another big thank you to Philomena, my great aunt, for allowing us to learn more about the war. And finally, a big thank you to Lexi's grandfather, Albert Mura, who allowed us to use his photos and learn more about the war.